It's The Wonkhe Show, a complete rewrite of the governance code, but will effectiveness reviews ever be more than performative? The opportunity gap that's been hiding in plain sight, white working class, girls, and minimum entry requirements. Not again. It's all coming up.
The sector has really only ever grown, and it is going to have to contract, but it's never really done that before, and so I don't know if anyone knows how that can happen.
Welcome back to The Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Jim Dickinson, and here to help us understand what's going on, as usual, three top draw guests. In Canterbury, Mike Ratcliffe is Interim Academic Registrar at Canterbury Christchurch University. Mike, your highlight of the week, please.
I'm living my life vicariously, so my highlight is my youngest winning biggest sustainable impact in her student union awards this week.
Fantastic stuff. In Westminster, Annie Bell is Associate Director Higher Education at Public First. Annie, your highlight of the week, please.
My highlight of the week is a fascinating and quite heartwarming focus group I ran with residents of York on Tuesday evening, looking at universities.
And in Crawley this week, David Kernohan is Deputy Editor at Wonkhe. DK, your highlight of the week, please.
It has to be the raw excitement that is the Wonkhe World Cup sweepstake. I have drawn Scotland, so obviously I'm hugely confident.
So yes, we start this week with governance. The Committee of University Chairs has published a rewrite of its governance code. DK, what has changed?
So everybody in higher education loves to complain about the state of governance. Apparently all of the problems the sector is facing are due to the way that universities are managed. There's been a lot of pressure from all kinds of sources for universities to clean up the way that they monitor the quality of their own governance. And yesterday saw the Committee of University Chairs publish their revised Code of Higher Education Government. What I think is interesting about this, I mean, you get the core principles and the standards that it would expect. There is a lot of should in there as well as must, which allows different kinds of institutions, if they can explain their reasons for doing so, to have different kind of governance. So that's really important as we get more and more new providers in the system that might not have the expectation and the plumbing of a traditional university. There's a great introduction on the site written by Ian Cornish, who chaired the Review's steering committee. He's particularly exercised on the idea of governance effectiveness reviews, those glorious moments where you get somebody in to make sure your board is doing the things it should and doing them properly, and there's more guidance to come on that. But there's still a lot of pressure even from ministers, and I believe we have a clip.
And while there's much to be celebrated about governance in the sector, there's also much that needs to be strengthened. We've seen widespread, overly optimistic planning across the sector, systemic over-reliance on international student income, insufficient long-term strategic planning, and weaknesses in financial forecasting. And unfortunately, these aren't isolated or confined to a small number of institutions. They do point to more systemic issues around governance and a historic lack of sustained focus on board-level responsibility for addressing emerging and long-term risk. So against that backdrop, the work that CUC has undertaken is really timely and really important.
So, Mike, is that fair? Should boards have been having a better look at long-term strategic defunding of the sector?
Well, it's helpful, isn't it, for politicians to be able to say, your autonomous institutions, it's your fault. So I think that's a relatively easy let off. I think there was an interesting sense when you watch the launch event that Jackie Smith did come across as slightly you have to get your house in order. And then contrasting with the kind of nicer HE people, including the chair of CUC, who seemed to be on a kind of Jack and Nori set in a comfy armchair. Jackie Smith was kind of in a bleak, blurred out office, telling us that we have to behave. I mean, we have to look at some. There was some palpable examples where institutions have not done tremendously well. This code doesn't apply to Scotland, but the Dundee example is continuing to work out. So it's obvious that we've got to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it's just on the politics, Annie. The government's position seems to be you should have been thinking long term. Get your house in order, and obviously to some extent that has to be matched with the ability to predict what government is going to do on things like funding or God knows what else.
Well, yes, and I think that probably there's been a bit of a failure in the sector yes, you might need to predict what government is going to do, but there's been predictions based on either there's been no attempt to predict what might happen, or there have been predictions based on a best case scenario. And if you're making kind of, financial and governance decisions, you probably want to be, at least considering the worst case scenario. And I think that this, is particularly applicable when it comes to international student recruitment. There are so many institutions who have been essentially assuming there will be growth year on year without necessarily taking into account the fact that the policy and public opinion environment does not support that. And actually, I think that I think there was a failure in the sector to recognise the really quite significant risk of a massive decline in international student numbers, which has now happened and probably will continue to happen. But most institutions, or at least a significant number of institutions, were projecting year-on-year growth.
I mean, DK, one of the things, therefore, that one of the allegations that's in here is that the sort of effectiveness reviews that get done are performative in too many cases. Is that fair? And is something like this actually going to fix it?
I mean, it is really a question of governance culture. I mean, there are potentially some boards out there where they just pay one of their mates to come in and say, yeah, everything looks fine here, not a problem. And they just get on with doing what they've always done and what they always have been doing. There is a case, especially in some of our older universities, that perhaps the time has not only come, but has probably passed, where you need to think about the kind of governments that you actually need in the modern, increasingly risk-filled sector environment. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in this code on risk and risk management and risk assessment, scenario testing, stress testing, etc. I mean, on one level, this is all stuff that any good board of anything should be able to do and do regularly. And there's always been that question that are boards of higher education providers really as professional as boards of like a FTSE 200 company or something like that? Are they acting in the same way? That is the overlap between the obvious need that you need to keep the thing sustainable, you need to keep being able to pay wages and teach students, but you also have charitable goals that might occasionally be at odds with that. And you also have the consideration that often the kind of thing a university would like to do and feels it needs to do is absolutely never going to wash its face. A good review of a board would really get into that. It would ask all those difficult questions. It would look at everything from economic stress testing to the delegation of authority and the way decisions are made. We saw the confusion around which documents are actually a governing document and which are not in the University of Sussex case. And that also is the kind of thing these reviews should be highlighting. I think in general, they are largely done well at larger institutions, but especially at newer institutions, it is the kind of thing that people might not be used to and might not entirely understand the required rigor or indeed the purpose of these things.
I mean, look, one of the things that really strikes me about this, Mike, is that there's a set of really activities and behaviours kind of laid out here. And the thing about that is that they are done by people. And one of the kind of lingering questions I've got when I read this is this that we've had the wrong people on governing bodies? And, is there a really clear link between the kind of expected behaviours and the people? Because in the end, if the people haven't asked difficult questions or said, yeah, but what if your grand plan all goes wrong? Surely we got the wrong people on these boards.
Yeah, it's tricky because the people can perform a role if they're entitled, if they know they can. So that I think you don't have to go out and find people who have got constructive challenge, kind of in their DNA. I think you need to give the people you've got the opportunity to think, yes, constructive challenge is going to be what we're going to do this evening at the governing body. So I think you can set that culture. I think if you go back a long way, there was a kind of clubbable nature to some governing bodies, and I think that isn't the case now. And I don't think anyone's really getting their mates in to be on the board of governors anymore. There is a lot more openness about how people appear on them. There's some quite strong should statements as well as the must statements in there. So terms of office has got to be limited. You've got to think about how you get people in. There's a notion of a senior independent board member. So there's trying to create new ways of making sure that the perhaps the most problematic bit is that relationship between the chair and the head of institution. So you're breaking up those kinds of what could be chummy and say, well, we'll challenge that, because I think those structures could do things. So I think you could do things through structures as well as going and thinking, well, I'll recruit people who are going to be up for challenging the institution.
Annie, I want to read you out a couple of quotes from a little thing I did last year where we surveyed outgoing student governors, right? And there's a couple of classic quotes in it. One says, "You're told at the start that your job is to manage the VC and the SMT, but they manage the governors. The chair and the VC behave like they have everything under control. Reassuring. The room just does not seem interested in education or the student experience." And then the other quote was, "Whenever I've asked a question or said something even questioning, let alone critical about the management, it's like I've suggested burning down their office. They're allowed to be both over-defensive and over-reassuring, rather than treat contributions from me and some of the other more vocal governors as contributions to thinking. Makes me think the whole thing is pointless."
Well, I've got some sympathy with that, to be honest with you. I do think, firstly, I just want to come to Mike's point about the risk of overly chummy relationships between chairs and heads of institution. I think there is also another risk, which is the opposite, which is that relationship is so tense that the head of institution or the kind of senior leadership team generally don't feel safe in being honest about the kind of state of affairs. And I think that some of what we've seen in the sector is that boards just perhaps haven't had all the information to make strong assessments, because there's a sort of nervousness about kind of sharing all the information, and a tendency towards over optimism. On the point about student governors, I think that this also perhaps speaks to a wider cultural issue that I've seen in some institutions that I've worked with, where the student union is seen as kind of inherently antagonistic towards the institution, and I can really see how that might permeate the kind of relationship between student governors and institutional leaders, and also perhaps a kind of assumption on behalf of the leaders of the institution that student representatives perhaps don't understand the complexities of running a large institution or the kind of financial imperatives. I actually think that is a slightly patronizing view, and in my experience, student leaders have been able to understand and make some really quite astute kind of observations and challenges about the way that institutions are run. And look, fundamentally, aside from research, the kind of primary goal of an institution is to teach and provide an experience to students. And if institutions aren't taking the students' views on board in doing that, then they are failing in some regard.
But it's super interesting, this to me, DK, because, even if I ignore the student aspect of this, I've been in loads of rooms where there's one person or two people that ask, really difficult questions. And then there's a sense that everyone else in the room's job is to sort of rally round and prove why the difficult person in the corner is wrong. And frequently that person's ended up being right. Now, in this instance, this was student governors, but there is this danger, isn't there, of the flow of a conversation being to reassure and defend rather than robustly challenge what's in front of people.
Yeah, and especially with a board or with particular governors or anybody in any meeting that feels less confident, you do get the sense, I mean, all of us, I guess, have probably sat in meetings and thought, well, we're not really quite qualified to be here, but if we just get on with it and we copy everything else and do what they say, it'll be fine. It's what makes it really important to have strong, independent governors and to have more experienced board members setting an example for newer recruits, and especially, as you highlight, Jim, in your usual way, student governors, in order to best get the value out of their different perspectives. A university and a university governance structure, if you don't know how it works, it can feel from the outside like a really, really scary thing. It does, again, it comes back to the culture of a board. And if you are dealing with the fact that you've run out of money and you're going to have to close a campus, it can be quite difficult to also model the kind of questioning, broad discussing behavior that a really good board would bring to questions like that. If there is an atmosphere of crisis in the room, if there is an atmosphere of everything is going to be terrible, so we have to do something that we don't want to do in the room, then actually speaking against that with authority is really, really difficult.
I guess the other thing that really strikes me here, Mike, is that in any culture, people want to reassure up, don't they? Right? So you would want to reassure your manager wants to reassure your manager's manager, and so on and so on. That gets the governing body, and then the governing body reassures OFS. Now, if you kind of collectivise that behaviour, then the entire sector is going to recruit twice as many international students than are available this time next year. Like, how do you turn that around? Because in theory, what you have to do to get honesty is get everyone to not reassure the person above them.
And I think reassurance is the problem. So I worked at a university that tried to stress that the job of the processes was to give assurance, but not just to blithely reassure people, because everyone can turn up and say, yes, it's all going to be fine, thanks. But you need to actually show how you're going to do that. So if you're projecting you're going to go and get a couple of hundred students from a new market, you need a bit more evidence than, we think this is going to be fine. So I think it's being rigorous about that process. If you're assuring up the chain, that's fine. And if you think about international students, for years, HEFGE and OFS have said, look, your projection of international students are way off. You're never going to recruit that many students. And then we did. So the sector overshot that 600,000 target in no time at all. Now, obviously, government is doing its level best to stop that. But we did meet those targets, and it was really weird. So I think those kinds of things, you can go out and achieve some of those targets, but you need assurance that you've got the processes in place and you're going to make it work, and not just a blithe, everything is going to be fine, we've got this in hand, leave us alone kind of reassurance.
Annie, bottom line here is, if I look at the various charts on the available number of international students that might be knocking around overall, and the available number of 18-year-olds overall, in theory, one of the things that happens is, and I'm not just talking the kind of really small providers on the long tail of the OFS register. I'm moving a little bit further towards kind of slightly larger providers. At some point, some of these things become unsustainable. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, if a governing body looks at the numbers and goes, on balance, we reckon we probably won't be here this time next year, is it clear enough that what they should do then is pack it all in and start a negotiation about transferring those students? Do you know what I mean? Because we must be close to some of those really tough decisions that people are having to make. And it feels like that's kind of going over the top.
I completely agree. There is just no way that the sector can remain the size it is in the next 10 years, even the next 5 years. There just aren't going to be enough students. And what's really interesting is that other sectors handle this all the time. In early years, for example, the sector talks about accordioning, which is, they expand to, in periods when there are more young children, and then they shrink in years when there are fewer. And what we've had in the higher education sector is, because the sector has been kind of expanding through a demographic boom in 18-year-olds, because we've had this massive growth in international students, the sector has really, really only ever grown, and it is going to have to contract. But it's never really done that before. And so I don't know if anyone knows how that can happen. And I also think that, again, because there's not the experience of this in, boards and in institutional leadership, I think that there isn't a clear, I suspect that most institutions will do absolutely everything they can to kind of, keep the doors open and keep going, perhaps beyond the point where they ought to. That said, we are already seeing mergers. We've had Greenwich and Kent, we've had Cranfield and Kings. So I don't think it's fair to say that people aren't thinking about this seriously, and I think we will see more mergers first, probably.
But DK, if we just flip ourselves then back to ministers, if the orthodoxy is think about this early, and if you think you're beyond the point, make arrangements to protect students. The truth is then that because all of this is done, kind of confidentially, it's not like the minutes of those meetings are going to be available in the next few weeks. The reality is that in 4 or 5 years' time, we might end up with a smaller sector. And I've not intended that parts of the country or some subject areas have completely disappeared. The kind of public goods. We want some subjects to be taught in some parts of the country. Doing it like this, where the market sort of does it and everyone has to behave confidentially, this isn't the way to run a higher education sector, is it?
It's not really, no. And I think this is something that a lot of people have been saying for a long time, that on one level, it might be okay to allow the market to control expansion, to allow popular courses, popular institutions to expand. I mean, obviously, there's arguments against that, as we can see with the current contemps about the Russell Group basically hoovering up all of the students and nobody else recruiting well. But you can at least see a case that, okay, we let demand determine the shape of the sector. But when the sector is contracting, which in terms of demographics, if nothing else, it is about to, and that's before you bring in the changing public opinion and the big screaming kind of banner headlines in the Daily Mail that said university, it's not worth it anymore because of something that Ian Mansfield's written over a policy exchange. That was a moment. You cannot allow the market to control where it contracts. I mean, the original vision of the OFS was that if an institution was struggling and it had to go in under, that was a good thing. That was a sign of a healthy market. And that's complete nonsense, because it's quite possible to be a very good institution providing very good courses and incredibly good research and still be financially on a precipice. I mean, there is a number of institutions that are in that are doing really well, that are doing everything right. But I mean, maybe they're not in a fashionable part of the country. Maybe they've chosen to expand in areas which are not currently fashionable around 18-year-olds. And you have to ask, who is helped by letting places like that close and that capacity being lost? And the answer, as far as I could see it, is it is absolutely nobody. It's okay to have a responsive growth of the sector, but if the sector is going to shrink, that needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed carefully.
Yes. I mean, one other thing, Mike, Ian Cornish, chair of Leeds Beckett, who led the review, says today that the code will be judged not on its quality, but on its impact. And I guess one of the questions, Mike, is will we understand the impact other than, I mean, how will we understand the impact, I guess is the question.
I'm sure there'll be a deep evaluation that we'll do at some point in the future. Individual institutions will understand when they have got better at this. I think, you can be slightly skeptical about the importance of some of those reviews you get done, but you can see improvements. And I think if the Board of Governors has a look at the kinds of things in the statements and has a reflect on that, I think, well, are we doing the best we could? I think that will make an impact. I think that will make some change. But how you would actually tell? Because I think, you couldn't necessarily say that any institution that falls over, that must have been a fault of its governance. In the same way, you can't actually say that any spectacularly successful university, that's because of its governance.
Yeah, no one says that, do they?
No. So, the University of Oxford, it's fantastic, but it doesn't conform with any of these things because it doesn't have an externally led board, etc., etc. So, there are people out there who will argue that actually academic governance is the most important thing. And that we should elect vice chancellors and all of those kinds of fun notions. Yeah, I mean, I think individual institutions will work it through and feel that they are getting better at doing this. And certainly, if you take a longitudinal view, the boards of governors and the councils that we could have seen 30, 40 years ago were not in the same league as boards of governors and councils are now.
One other question, Mike. So this is a code of governance for the kind of, the board, the court, the board of governors, the university council. We don't have one for kind of academic governance. And one of the things that sort of happens every few years is someone will say, partly because I guess they're legally responsible and it's OFS that holds this body to account, that kind of this body, the court, the council, the board of governors, should get better at understanding the academic stuff. Now, there's an argument, isn't there, for some improvement work on the academic governance side?
Yeah, and it does address that. And in England, because the OFS is now pointing squarely at the governing body and not just at the head of institution, and QAA kind of pointed more at senates and academic boards. So there was a kind of, we want to know what those processes look like. I think boards of governors are getting much more information, much more engaged in the academic side of things because, that's the core business. And I think that makes sense. If you've got a board of governors that spends his entire time worrying about the investment portfolio and how many halls of residence to build, but doesn't actually think, are the courses up to date? Are they running properly? How does the student complaint systems work? I think they're not seeing the whole picture. So I think people are getting the sense of that. And a good academic structure fits with that, particularly if you don't want that thing that the single point of information up to the board is the head of institution. You also want the Senate and academic board kind of structures to feed that as well. And that if you're doing that well, that sense of constructive challenge absolutely applies at the academic governance end as well as the board of governors end.
Great stuff. Let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hi, I'm Glenn Noble, Director of Higher Education Practice at the UK National Committee on China. And this week on Wonkhe, I've been blogging about China's 15th five-year plan and its implications for UK universities. We all know that China plays a huge role in the future of the global knowledge economy. Its students contribute significant fees to the UK institutions, and its companies increasingly dominate emerging industries. The 15th five-year plan sets out key priorities that will have a substantial impact on the UK. For example, it will be more important and more difficult to collaborate in research than ever before. I think Chinese universities will increasingly compete directly with UK institutions for both students and researchers in key fields. And the collapse in Chinese undergraduate cohort from 2033 onwards is going to have massive implications for UK institutions. It's therefore more important than ever that UK institutions develop their knowledge of China and a clear strategy for secure and sustainable engagement.
Now, next up, who gets left behind? The Sutton Trust has layered gender and ethnicity onto its opportunity work. What's the headline here, Mike?
The headline is that geography matters. So what we have here is the kind of, this is where we're looking at intersectionality, but we're looking at it on a regional and in some cases a constituency basis, looking across the country at how that works. And clearly there are some things we kind of know, that London is unique, but the proposition here is it's unique because of its demographics, that the high performance of education in London is driven by ethnicity of the people who live in London, and that groups are performing in different ways, and therefore the proportion of a different group in a different part of the country is actually a key part of the driver behind that. that highlights one of the kind of big questions that's sitting out there at the moment in government and parties that want to become government, of what's happening to the white working class. And there's a headline here that actually, if you strip out some of the noise, white working class girls underperform against everyone else, which is a new and different thing. But one of the things I think we can look at it is that these things can change, because one of the highest performing demographic groups is Bangladeshi girls. And you only have to go back 20 years where Bangladeshi girls were one of the lowest performing ethnic groups in terms of educational. So that there are things afoot in how that works. But obviously what it calls for, therefore, is us to think about that geography when we think about our actions and what we're going to do. Because educational performance and then earning performance is a different thing if you're in the Northwest than if you're in London or the Southeast.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. Now, DK, you've looked at this issue that is buried in here, or not particularly buried in here, but is in here, which is obviously lots and lots of people have been taking to social media and posting on LinkedIn and so on over the last few years, talking about the plight of working class boys. But there's something going on with working class girls, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the really interesting findings on this. I mean, the amount of lobbying there's been about white working class pupils more generally and white working class boys in particular has been huge. There is a problem there. But yes, girls do experience a particularly pronounced effect if they happen to have the free school meal march, and if they don't, they attain less strongly, they have less strong life chances, and the salary gap is particularly large. And this, as far as I'm aware, is not really something that has been talked about before. There's lots of things potentially overlapping. I mean, this is a theme of the report, is, as Mike says, intersectionality. That if you live in the kind of place where there's not many opportunities, where there's maybe not a culture that education is valued, then you're probably going to attain less well. That's also going to feed into your ongoing career, as is the place where you live. And the idea of being in a particular state of poverty within that place, that just adds something to that. On one level, because they look at earnings and destinations at age 28, that is round about the time that people have historically been thinking about starting families. And obviously, time off for pregnancy, time off for parenting, that does have an impact on what young women do and their expectations for the rest of their lives. But it does look like a problem. And interestingly, it does look like a problem in particular areas. It's particularly pronounced in London, which is maybe the opposite of what you might expect, because you think of London as the land of milk and honey, where everybody earns more than everything else, and for some reason a sandwich at Pret costs £8 and everybody's okay with that. There are parts of London, as we all know, that are really struggling, that are really low in opportunity, and because of the ethnic mix of London, people who are really struggling, it looks like they are really, really struggling. So it's a really interesting finding, and I expect to hear a lot more discussion about this in the future, maybe in Parliament.
And just for clarity, it's not that white working class girls are doing worse than white working class boys, is it? It's the direction of travel.
Yeah, this is a trend that seems to be expanding, that the differences are getting more pronounced. And it's always really dangerous to try and draw causality based on that. But it is possible, perhaps, that the decline in entry-level roles is particularly affecting white working class women. But there's a lot more research needed to get to the bottom of exactly what is going in there.
I guess the other thing in here, Annie, that is fascinating to me is this stuff about free school meals, because free school meals is invoked as obviously both a sort of statistical category, but also, frequently by politicians as, a group of people we need to think about and worry about. But it looks like a kind of faulty marker, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is a faulty marker, in part because different people are eligible for free school meals in different parts of the country, in part because the rules are kind of subject to change, in part because the data is incomplete. I mean, look, this is a real problem generally, when we're doing research at Public First and we want to define, people from a kind of disadvantaged socioeconomic background or kind of from a working class background, there kind of is no really reliable marker. And I think the reason why free school meals is used is because it feels more precise than a lot of the other measures we use. So, looking at parental occupation, for example, or looking at kind of areas where people live, are all unreliable in their own ways. And it does actually make it quite hard to have serious discussions about this.
Yeah, once people get into university and then get out into the labour market, Mike, one of the things that really strikes me about all of this is that if you look at the IFS work, the poorest people get the biggest financial gains from a degree in comparison to poorest people who don't go to university. But they're not getting the same sort of returns as richer people who get into higher education. And we're stuck here, aren't we, in this? Is this about the sort of absolute, comparisons once people are in the labour market? Or should we be comparing to people who don't go to university in each social class?
Yeah. So what are you trying to measure? The control group of people who haven't gone to university obviously is a group of people who, there's a lot of complexity in there as to what are you doing. Now, clearly, if you want to be a doctor, you're going to have to go to university. So there isn't a kind of easy control group. Whereas if you become a web designer, you could have gone to university, or you could not have gone to university, and find that AI is going to do it for you anyway. So it probably wasn't that smart. But those kinds of comparisons between have you gone or have you not gone, clearly going to university enables a huge set of new opportunities that you wouldn't have done otherwise. But we can say that the opportunity to go to university, the opportunity to follow the subject that you want to do locally or that is again different from where you are. So that London effect, yes, you've got far more people in education, sustained education from 16 to 18 in London than in other parts of the country. You've got more universities, more choice. You can choose between a lot of different places. Whereas if you're reliant on staying in the town you are, you may not have a university at all, or you may have just the choice of one university to go to. So there are going to be just those differences, and that really does play out in the data that they've mined here. So how we've got to think about how universities can act to provide that opportunity.
Higher education is a system of moving parts.
Funding, teaching, research, governance, data, students, strategy, culture, international.
Each one a world in itself, and all of them connected.
Most people in a sector know their part well. What's harder to come by is a working knowledge of the whole.
How the pieces fit.
Where the pressure points are.
And what's driving the decisions that land on your desk.
Here at Wonkhe, we're doing something about that.
Making sense of higher education is 10 live online modules running every 3 weeks from October 26 to April 27.
Public value.
Funding and finance.
Teaching and learning.
Student experience.
Research.
Internationalisation.
Strategy.
Data.
People and culture.
Leadership and governance.
It's delivered by Team Wonkhe with a raft of special guests.
Every session is recorded and shared, so if you can't make it live, you won't miss out.
It's for people new to higher education who need a proper induction into how the sector works.
For governors who need cross-sector fluency, fast.
For experienced professionals ready to contribute beyond their own patch.
There's a free taster session coming up soon, and early bird pricing is 10% off until the 31st of July.
We cannot wait to help you make sense of higher education.
Find out more at wonkhe.com/events. Now, finally this week, the return of minimum entry requirements. The Guardian reports that DfE is looking at restricting loan access to those with a GCSE English pass. Annie, what's going on here?
Yes, MERS ride again. So this is the Guardian report, as you said, that the government is considering an English GCSE as a prerequisite for access to student loans. This is, of course, not the first time that this proposal has been floated around in recent years. You'll remember it was mentioned in the Auger Review, and then in, I think it was 2022, the government consulted on introducing minimum entry requirements. That was after consultation with the sector. That idea was not taken forward, but you might remember that Michelle Donnellan, the minister at the time, said, we're keeping this on the table if the sector doesn't essentially clean up its act in terms of quality. Since then, there has been growth in particularly franchise provision in the higher education sector. And I think there is perhaps a sense from government here that, although it's a different government, a Labour government now, that perhaps the sector hasn't taken action it might have expected to move away from some of that kind of rapidly expanding franchise provision, to move away from courses that accept large numbers of students with kind of few or no previous qualifications. Whether or not that is actually an accurate measure of quality, I think that's a different conversation. But this would apparently affect about 33,000 students, the majority of them in studying at franchise providers. That estimate came out as part of an FT article last week. I mean, it's important to say that this is just speculation at this point. The briefing I was given for this podcast said, this is speculation. Clear that it's speculation, and it is. But I would point to a kind of interesting series of events, which is that last week the Policy Exchange published a really quite damning report on the sector and proposed a whole raft of measures. Of which, minimum entry requirements is just one of. Ian Mansfield, the author of that report's ideas. And then the Russell Group put out a statement responding to that and explicitly saying that they would be open to considering minimum entry requirements. And then the FT published a piece analysing how many students in higher education did not have GCSEs. And then this idea was leaked to The Guardian. And that feels to me like a series of events that suggests that someone in government is very seriously considering this.
Well, how exciting. It's like a really dull detective show, this.
I do watch a lot of crime dramas too.
It's a kind of dull procedural. Look, DK, you've been crunching some numbers on this today.
Yeah. So this disproportionately has an impact on mature students. Of the round about 30k students that do not have any formal qualifications, which seem to be the numbers that the FT and others are relying on, round about 25, 26k of them are over the age of 24, which, if you think about, the government is at the same time trying to run something like the lifelong learning entitlement, which is explicitly aimed at people who may have spent a large part of their lives in the workplace or want to upskill or change career and might not have that pesky GCSE in English, but might be perfectly literate and able to demonstrate that in other ways. Those are the people that it's going to affect. The other people that are going to be effective is the people who have recently expanded into franchise provision in a large way. Overwhelmingly, if you see a large number of students with no formal qualifications, it is going to be at a franchise partner, and the handful of about 6 or 7 universities that have really gone into that kind of provision in a big way, they are the ones towards the top of the charts on this. I feel like I should also mention that this is not, strictly speaking, a minimum entry requirement, because there's big chunks of HERA that say that the government and ministers are not allowed to get involved in universities' admission decisions. And that's not in doubt. This is an eligibility requirement. You would need to be able to demonstrate that you had particular GCSEs that are specified in order to access student finance in the form of fee loans and maintenance loans. I mean, that also gives us a little moral hazard in that it would be perfectly okay for you to go to university if you were paying for it yourself, but not if the government are doing it, which immediately, it gives us a not particularly attractive two-tier system.
Mike, just take us through the contours of this for a second, because if I'm reading the Telegraph or the Times and I see, or the FT in this case actually, and I see a significant surge in people who don't even have GCSE English getting into what is written up as university, that it seems to be a fairly straightforward line to sell to those readers that something dodgy is afoot.
Yeah, so you need that extra context that a large proportion of those students who may not have that GCSE in English recorded are probably doing a foundation year, and the whole point of the foundation year is to get them up to the point where they can benefit from doing a full higher education course. But of course, you record them as having joined that course without those qualifications. But really, what they're doing is they're joining a degree course having done a year's worth of access work. So we've not been sniffy in the past about people who've not got formal qualifications and done an access course, but now these things are linked and you get one student record for that 4-year course. Everyone can get themselves very excitable about the fact that people are accessing higher education, although that for various different reasons, sometimes that they would in the UK at the time, they've not been able to access or succeed at 16 to 18 education. So I think some of that is you need that extra context to understand that we're finding new ways of making sure that people can have access to higher education.
Annie, just to add to your little detective story, we are weeks away from DfE putting out its annual sort of look at student loans repayments and so on and so on. And we know that the department is always working on revising its predictions of how much money is going to come back in 20, 30 or 40 years based on, what's actually happening now. And one of the things that must be starting to happen is the big increase in franchising will be starting to feed through into that model. And, if everything we know about prior attainment that we talked about earlier is true, in theory, the hypothesis would be students graduating from those degrees are not paying back as much of their student loan as early as everybody else.
That's a really interesting way of framing it, Jim, because it sounds like you're suggesting that the government is actually not in the government's interest to expand access to higher education, which I think is a very fascinating and controversial question that actually I think there might be something in. But to your broader point, yes, I think that DfE and the Treasury are likely having very difficult conversations, not least because DfE has had to make the case for putting the tuition fee up, and I think that some part of the quid pro quo on that will have been that they have to find savings elsewhere. So we're likely to see the strategic priorities grant, for example, being cut very shortly, and I think that this drive to cut the number of students studying through franchise provision is probably part of trying to, reduce spendings in some ways. And I think that this is part of that. I think, the government made quite an extraordinary intervention on weekend-only courses recently, which I think didn't come off in quite the way they might have hoped. And I think this feels like just another angle through which they can attack franchise provision, frankly, in order to kind of, try and bring down some of that expenditure.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we've discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes on wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks very much to Mike, Annie, David, Michael, Salmon for making it all happen. We'll be back next week. Mark will be here. Until then, stay wonky.